G'day, dear viewers, and thank you for your company once again here on truth2u.org. That's truth number 2 letter u.org. I'm Jono Vandor, and joining me from the Horeb Institute in Louisiana is, of course, the author of the Moses Scroll, Ross Nichols. G'day, mate.
How are you, Jono?
Doing pretty well, thank you, my friend. We have so much to get to this show. It is, of course, time for Season 3 of Torah Pearls, brought to you by Tanakh Tours. That's Tanakh Tours.com. TanakhTours.com, taking you to where it happened and bringing your Tanakh to life. Our next adventure,
don't be left behind. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I'm telling you. Yep.
The Ultimate Tanakh Tour, November 2025, and you can secure your seat on the bus at TanakhTours.com. So don't delay. Tickets are limited, and you're going to save some money if you do that before 2025. Details on the website. Season 3 of Torah Pearls, Ross, is in light of critical scholarship and, of course, the Moses Scroll and other ancient sources as well. And while we're talking about other books, the Torah tablet, just tell everybody where they can get hold of one of those, because that's an invaluable tool for this season of Torah Pearls. Go ahead.
That's right. Of course, the easiest way to get to it, Jono, is in the description of each of the videos on Torah Pearl Season 3. Right below our beautiful faces, all they have to do is find Torah Pearl, Torah tablet. They click it, takes them straight to it. And we really encourage them to get these. Genesis and Exodus will be rolling off the press soon, so get them.
Ooh,
get them while they're hot. That's right.
Get them while they're hot. Is Exodus already available? You can order that now?
As soon as we approve, which we think will be this week, as soon as we approve the proof.
Watch this space.
That's right. We'll have them in the description below. I
am going to kick off, Ross, with questions and comments first, if that's all right, because Mama MacGyver, she commented again with an excellent comment, and she checked our math on the last program that we did. Now, you remember we were talking about, and this was a little bit rushed on our part, which is fine, but we were talking about how long had Joseph been missing, because you pointed out that he was already gone. How long had he been missing by the time Jacob and Esau buried Isaac at the age of 180? He was 180 when he died. Mm-hmm. So I think she's correct. This is what let me see if I can explain this in a way that makes sense.
Okay. All right. Because I admitted I'm not good at math, so I think she came in to help. Is that right? She
came in to help, and I think she's got this right. She said, okay. I think Joseph had been gone for 12 years when Isaac was buried, because, and this is the way that it works, Jacob is 130 when he is presented before Pharaoh. We agree. We have these are dates that we have references for in the Bible. Joseph rose to power at the age of 30. We've got that. There had been 7 and 2 years between these two events. First, the 7 years of plenty, and then they were 2 years into the famine.
Yeah.
That's it. Thus, 130 minus 39, because 30 and 2 and minus 30, he was 91. Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. By the time Isaac dies at 180, Jacob is 120. 120 minus 91 equals 29 years between those events. Joseph is abducted at the age of 17. We talked about that last week. And 29 minus 17 is 12. So there you go. Beautiful. Therefore, Joseph has been presumed dead by Jacob, as far as he knows, an event that we're yet to read about, for 12 years already, Ross.
Okay.
12 years by the time Isaac is buried. Now, while I check this out, I discovered something else, and it might be something else that you may have already mentioned, and the penny didn't drop for me, but it turns out that this is the least of the problems with the narrative. Jacob was in service for Laban, right, for 20 years. We know that because he says so much. And he says 7 years for Leah, 7 years for Rachel, and 6 years making spotted sheep, or whatever he's doing there, and growing his own flock. In the 14th year, he fathered Joseph at the age of 91. Thus, 91 minus 14 is 77. So we can conclude, get this, that Jacob and Esau were 77 when Jacob left Isaac, right? That when he fled from the house. Remember Rebecca? Yeah, okay. Therefore, Isaac was 60 when they were born. Yeah, when they were born. He was plus 77 years. The boys are 77 when Jacob leaves. Now Isaac is 137, right? That makes sense?
Mm-hmm. It does.
Okay. Now, I might get Ezra to do this. Ezra, can you read Genesis chapter 27, verse 1 to 7?
And it came to pass that when Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau his elder son and said unto him, My son. And he said unto him, Here am I. And he said, Behold, now I am old, I know not the day of my death. Now therefore take, I pray thee, thy weapons, thy quiver and thy bow, and go out to the field and take me venison, and make me savory food, such as I love, and bring it to me, that I may eat it, that my soul may bless thee before I die. And Rebekah heard when Isaac spake to Esau, his son. And Esau went to the field to hunt for venison, and to bring it. And Rebekah spake unto Jacob her son, saying, Behold, I heard thy father speak unto Esau thy brother, saying, Bring me venison, and make me savory food, that I may eat, and bless thee before Jehovah before my death.
Okay. So, his death is imminent, as far as we can tell here. He's saying, I'm about to die. I want to bless you before I die. Go and make me some of that delicious food, and then we'll do that. All right, now let's see. Ezra, read me chapter 27, verse 41 to 45.
And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, The days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then will I slay my brother Jacob. And the words of Esau, her elder son, were told to Rebekah. And she sent and called Jacob her younger son, and said unto him, Behold, thy brother Esau comforteth himself concerning thee, purposing to kill thee. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. And arise, flee thou to Laban my brother to Haran, and tarry with him a few days, until thy brother's fury turn away, until thy brother's anger turn away from thee, and he forget that which thou hast done to him. Then I will send, and fetch thee from thence. Why should I be bereaved of you both in one day?
Right.
All
so,
right.
Ross, notice, the days of mourning for my father are at hand. The days for mourning of my... And Isaac himself is saying to Esau, hey, I'm on my last legs. Go and make me some delicious food. I'm going to give you the blessing because I'm going to die soon. And then Esau says, yeah, I'm going to be mourning my father, and I hate Jacob now because he's taken the blessing. And then his mother says, you've got to flee, go in haste and everything. Like it's all.
And see, this is why I know, and this is why I think it's important to figure out the ages, because if you read the story, you get the impression that he's on his deathbed, but as it turns out, he's going to be laying up in bed for, decades. If you do the math.
That's exactly it. If you do the math. So now that's J. Those two passages that that Ezra just read belong to J. But according to P, Genesis 27:46 to Genesis 28 verse 5, we get a slightly different story. Maybe Ezra can read that. Genesis 27:46 to 28:5.
And Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these, of the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do me? And Isaac called Jacob, and charged him, and said unto him, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, thy mother's father, and take thee a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban, thy mother's brother. And God Almighty bless thee, and make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, that thou mayest be a company of peoples, and give thee the blessing of Abraham, to thee, and to thy seed with thee, that thou mayest inherit the land of thy sojournings, which God gave unto Abraham. And Isaac sent away Jacob, and he went to Paddan Aram unto Laban, son of Bethuel the Syrian, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob's and Esau's mother.
So Ross, very clearly, I think this is just a classic example of two different sources, because now we have what was go in haste, hurry up, Esau's going to kill you, you've taken the blessing, and Isaac's about to die, and then all of this sort of stuff. All of a sudden now we have a different story where Rebekah's going, I don't like these girls. I don't want my boy to get a wife from one of these girls. And Isaac's like, hey, son, come over here. There's no problem, as if none of that ever happened. Hey, listen, go back to this land and get a daughter, a wife for yourself, blah, 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 blah. Here's a blessing for you, by the way, as a blessing before you go. And if that wasn't enough to convince someone of two different sources, my point, and to your point, According to J, Isaac's death is imminent at the age of 137. But according to P, Ross, Isaac dies 43 years later. It's 43 years at the age of 180.
You know, and it's funny, and this is, by the way, I'll put, I want people to know, if they look in the description, there's a link to my class last Sabbath, because I got into some of these things too. It's the math. If you don't do the math, and I apologize to my math teachers, because I told them I would never use this, and here we are. But it's amazing, though, when you look at it, because it feels like there are all these problems, but once you separate the sources, and we're going to see some of that in the Joseph saga, you see that it depends. If you read all of, for instance, today we're going to be dealing with E and J, and you read E, and it's going to be fairly consistent. You read J, it's going to be fairly consistent. But when they're put together, it introduces difficulties that are insurmountable. That's
absolutely. That's a really good way of putting it. That's an excellent way of putting it. I couldn't have said it better. And Denick Christian 335 commented regarding the number 17. We talked about that last week as well, and he just pointed out that Noah's Ark came to rest on the 17th day of the 7th month. Quite right. And I also noticed that Yom Kippur, Ross, falls on the 10th day of the 7th month, which add those two numbers together and you get 17. And I just out of curiosity, I did look on the wiki, and I encourage everyone to do this. Look up number 17, the significance of the number 17. I had no idea. If you're into math, and I know Dave is, Dave, but Dave is. And so it's just remarkable. And I'm not going to go into detail because it goes on for...
Thank God. I'm done with math. I'm ready to get into the Joseph saga, Jono.
I'm telling you.
I can't do math anymore. I'm mathed out tonight.
Well, you can't be mathed out, because coming to the end of this program, we're going to just touch on it again. I know that you have a question from Claudia. I don't know if you want to touch on that now. We may get to that later. What do you want to do?
Yeah, we're gonna get to it later. Let me jump in. One of the things that's, I think, really important as we get into the Joseph saga. We already know Joseph from chapter 30 when the children are born, and you touched on a little bit of that. We know that Joseph is a favored son from the favored wife. And one thing I just wanted to touch on, as we get into this Torah portion, and as we get into the Joseph saga, remember Genesis, thanks to our ancient editor, our redactor, who gave us 10 of these Eli Toledotes in the book of Genesis. Now we're in Eli Toledot Yaakov. But it's not really about Yaakov, but I don't want people to get confused, because Eli Toledot doesn't mean it's about Yaakov. It means that it's about the generations of. So what he gets into, though, he says, these are the generations of, or the bringings forth, if you will, of Jacob. And then immediately it says Joseph. Now we're going to talk about what source this is and all, but the writer here wants us to know that this is going to be, it's going to be the song of Joseph, right? It's going to be all about Joseph.
As soon as I read it, I thought, oh, there's an interruption in the sources. And of course, I went and had a look, and lo and behold, 37 verse 1 is attributed to P. And Jacob lived in the land of his father's residence, in the land of Canaan. And these, verse 2, starts with, these are the records of Jacob. And again, you're expecting to see something akin to a genealogy or something like that, such that we saw in the previous chapters, but we don't get that. It, as you point out, it immediately starts with the narrative or the novella of Joseph, and it kicks off with the priestly source, and then Friedman attributes these are the records of Jacob to the redactor, which is interesting.
By the way, every time that phrase appears, according to Richard Elliott Friedman, that is the redactor, because the redactor, the final editor, is looking for a way to stitch these various stories together, and that is the thing that this editor used. And so it's always listed as a redactor, and then we'll get into J and E, which we'll do in just a minute. I wanted to say one thing, we already talked about the garments, but one thing that we have to watch in the Joseph saga, it actually goes a little bit before the Joseph saga, when you just talked a little bit about Isaac, who was on his deathbed, and and Jacob put on this garment, right? So Jacob starts the garment change, but we're going to follow the garments. When you get into the Joseph story, when you read about Tamar in chapter 38, it's like a play. They're
like
changing.
A play with a
the
wardrobe.
Curtain closes, opens up, and they're
New
changing
wardrobe.
garments. Yep.
Yeah,
Got to watch.
And you know what? I hadn't noticed that until you mentioned it to me. So, but you're absolutely right. So that's going to be interesting. Now, the first thing though that I noticed, besides the interruption to the source, verse 2. Now, here's a question for you, Ross. Bilhah and Zilpah, are they wives or are they concubines?
Yeah. Well, the word wife is never used in the Hebrew Bible.
Woman.
It's always woman. So what does the Hebrew have there? Did you look? Well,
it's interesting. I think so. Verse 2 refers to, let's see, Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, it says. And that's interesting because if you go back to verses like 30, verse 4, and 35, verse 22, let's just do that for a second.
Yeah, by the way, it's Nasheh Aviv. It's the women of his father.
And so this is 30 verse 4, and she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as a wife, right? If we go to 35:22, we're going to see that it says, and these are both attributed to the J source, and when Israel was tenting in that land, Reuben went up and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, we have. But then here, she is referred to as a wife again. Now, they're all attributed to J, interestingly. It's worth mentioning once again that the Moses Scroll, though it doesn't mention the names of the matriarchs, it does recognize them in the order that they became matriarchs, in the order that they became mothers, which is an interesting thing. But yeah, there's just a discrepancy there.
I just have to look at the Hebrew. I don't know. Like I said, in 37, it clearly says the women of. And I don't know if concubine is, I don't know if it's a discrepancy, Jono, or if it's, what's that?
35:22 does use the word concubine in regards to.
Okay. Yeah, and I don't know
35:22.
that it's a discrepancy as much as it could be just a different word for, it's a woman, she's also a concubine. I don't know.
Yeah, but you know what? The interesting thing about it is
what you said also, though, is the consistency of the sources, though. Now, that's a big point.
That's right. This is all attributed to J, and yet where Bilhah is referred to as a concubine happens to be the same verse where the demotion or the demonization of Reuben is established. So this is where he went up to the couch and slept with her, not not his woman, but his concubine. I guess it's kind of a demoting of her as well.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, let me just say, one of the things that I wanted to get in before we move into the story in chapter 37 is we're not going to see, there's something we're not going to see with Joseph that we saw with some of the other patriarchal narratives, and that is we're not going to have any encounters with angels. We're not going to have any of that kind of stuff. Now, God is going to speak with Joseph in some ways, there is a communication, but what we're going to see is once we get into the Joseph saga, we're either going to see divination, whatever that means, we'll get to that later, or we see dreams and visions, if you will, but we're not going to see the angel of the Lord appearing and so forth. And I think that's interesting that this section is different in that regard.
Absolutely.
What do you think about that?
Well, I absolutely agree, and there's a note on that in the Jewish Study Bible, which I have here, and he makes a point of saying that, let's see, whereas the latter takes up the form predominantly of a small, self-contained passage, the story of Joseph resembles a coherent novella with a subtle and well-crafted plot. Its theology, too, is different, whereas the patriarchal narrative is replete with appearances of God and so on and so forth, to your point. And he highlights the fact that it is really very different from what we've been reading so far. Verse 3, and you've already mentioned this, Israel loved Joseph the most of all. of course, he also loved Rachel most of all. And he also demoted Reuben, and he also adopted Manasseh and Ephraim, and he also promoted Ephraim over Manasseh. And as the saying goes, Ross, follow the money. We're going to be looking at that a little closer as we progress through this. 37, verse 9 and 10 is J. What do we have there? But according to E, we're to understand that, now we're talking about the vision, right? He says to his brothers, I had this vision, I had this dream, rather, that we were binding sheaves and all of your sheaves were bowing to mine and I'm so great and you guys are...
Yeah, but wait, before you get in the dream, I got to say, there's something else that leads up to this. We can split it out in sources in a minute, but one thing that's important is he's already in trouble with the boys before the dream. All right,
he's rubbing it in.
Not only because he's daddy's boy. He's got that beautiful coat. Now we don't know, by the way, coat note pasim. We don't know if that's a coat of many colors. I hate to spoil it for people because I like all those beautiful coats of many colors, but it really probably just means a long robe, a royal type robe. Even though tradition has it in colorful stripes, so keep your colorful striped robe, if you will. But the thing I wanted to point out is he gets in trouble, but not with all of the children, not all the sons of Israel. He rats out. That's what we call it. You know, when you tattle, he tattles on certain brothers. Notice it says that he's tending sheep with the sons of Bilhah, which you just mentioned, and Zilpah. So what we really have is he's got four of his older brothers, Dan and Naphtali and Gad and Asher, and then he tells daddy on them. So go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you. I want to make sure, though.
That's interesting, isn't it, Ross?
Yeah.
I find that really interesting because the next thing that we read about that is, and then his dad gave him a nice little coat, whatever that wardrobe change is. But there's just that little dig, isn't it? Again, perhaps by way of demotion or saying these ones are misbehaving, they're the ones of the lesser wives, if you like. Or at least that's the suggestion. So verse 9, he dreamed another dream, and it was told to his brothers, saying, look, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bound. Now, it's very clear what is being said here, and even Jacob picks up on this, that the sun and the moon is Jacob and Rachel and the 11 brothers. But the problem is, of course, Ross, what's the problem?
Well, the problem is that according to what we read earlier in chapter 35, Rachel, his mother, is dead. Now, look, I have to confess, Jono, I've looked for all sorts of mystical mumbo-jumbo reasons as to why he's saying that. In other words, is it some sort of prophetic thing? When he talks about, are you suggesting your mom and I? And, well, the problem is that we didn't know about the sources, right? I mean,
exactly.
It sorts it out, doesn't it? What do we see if we break
does sort it out?
It's totally different. One of the
Look,
things
we
that,
had. Let me just to that point. Obviously, this is the third season of Torah Pearls, and in previous seasons, people can go back and listen, and you will find the spin to explain away this discrepancy. But clearly, two different sources. One is E, one is J, and according to J, she is not dead. She just hasn't died.
Yeah, and just to clarify, so the readers can follow, especially if you're looking in, say, the Genesis Torah tablet. If you read chapter 35:18, let me just do that, Jono. If I read 35:18, it says, "And it came to pass, as her soul was departing," talking about Rachel, for she died, parenthetically, that she called his name Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin. Now that, as you said, is E. So if you don't recognize the sources, you miss this. But when you get here, when you get to chapter 37 and you read verse 9 and it says, it mentions the mother and the brothers, and you've got this discrepancy that you have to spin, you have to explain, until you look and you go, wait a minute, that's J. So J, that source doesn't know. Anyway, just wanted to make sure that was clear. I think it's a brilliant example of how important it is to see these different sources.
Yeah. And as you say, there is an attempt to, well, obviously we're holding the attempt, we're reading it now, to stitch these two sources together, and it's just in this particular section, it's just proved a little bit difficult, particularly in chapter 37. Staying in 37. So last week we talked about how Jay sets out to dethrone, if you like, Reuben as the firstborn in order to install Ephraim and Manasseh. We'll get there eventually. You made mention of an interpretation of the text where Reuben is seen to continually attempt to make amends. He's always trying to do the right thing, and because he is the firstborn, and he wants to assume that role, and he wants to be responsible and take care of everything. And it seems like he's going out of his way. But when you separate the sources, what we see is that Reuben's actually just being the older brother. So we see that in 37, 21, 22, verses 29 and 30, even 42 to 22. We'll get there eventually. I'm just going to point that out. But
This is a good place for Clody's comment, by the way.
Let's go ahead. Let's do Clody's comment then.
Yeah, so Clody asked, and this plays in, I think, a perfect segue. She said, which of the sources favors the tribe of Judah more? So she's reading through the Torah tablet. She sees the different sources, and she gave me a little bit of what she was seeing, and she's right on. But think about this. Like you're showing the difference between Reuben and Judah. When you read this in the Bible as we have it, chapter 37, just straight through, it's a little bit confusing because in part of the text, it seems like Reuben is stepping up, as you put it, to play the big brother and to step in and maybe to try to redeem for what he did to his father, you have to try to make sense of it. And then in another part of the story, it seems that Judah is supposed to be. But if we separate them apart, we get the clear picture. And both of these are amazing.
Do you want me to read one of these? If I read E? All right. Let me read E from verse 17. It says, actually, let me go from 17b, okay. And Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. And they saw him from a distance. And before he came close to them, they conspired against him to kill him, Ross. And Reuben heard, and he saved him from their hand. And he said, let's not take his life. And Reuben said to them, don't spill blood. Throw him into this pit that's in the wilderness here, and don't put your hand out against him. And he said this in order to save him from their hand, to bring him back to his father. And they they took him and they threw him into the pit, and the pit was empty and there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread. Oh my goodness. And continuing in verse 28, and Midianite people, merchants, passed, and they pulled and lifted Joseph from the pit. 29. And Reuben came back to the pit, and here Joseph was not in the pit. And he tore his clothes, and he went back to his brothers, and he said, the boy is gone. And where can I go? Like, which direction do I go to find him? I don't even know. He's gone. And the Midianites sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, chief of the guards. Do you want to read out Jay, or what would you like to do with this, Ross?
Yeah, well, Jay splits out. One of the things, let's see, I can pick it up about kind of in the story where Jay takes over, but instead of Reuben, it has Judah, okay?
Go ahead.
Let's start in verse 23. It came to pass when Joseph was coming to his brethren that they stripped Joseph of his coat, the coat of many colors that was on him. They lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites, Jono. I think you said Midianites or Midianites or something.
Midianites.
Anyway, it's supposed to be Ishmaelites, Jono, was coming from Gilead, and their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, Jono, and let not our hands be upon him, for he is our brother, our flesh, and his brethren hearkened to him. And they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt, and so forth. Now, I'm going to stop there because it highlights some of the biggest differences between J and E.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important to see, if you look in E, Reuben is the one who saves Joseph.
Yep.
If you look at J, it's Judah that saves. So,
Mm-hmm.
so just on that point, when Clody asked the question, which source is it that favors the tribe of Judah? I would put it this way: J is going to put. I think we'll see this bear out as we work through. J is going to put Judah as a prominent character in the narrative, more prominent than most. Doesn't mean that he's always favored. In fact, it doesn't always present Judah in a favorable light, but he is the star of the show.
He's
That's
the star
the way
of the
I
show,
would
absolutely.
put it. Yeah.
So that's great. Now, another thing that some commentators have noticed, and I'm just going to read it out now, and you may have an opinion on this. I'm not sure what to make of it myself. But when you compare that story, particularly chapter 37, verse 29 to 35, with Jeremiah 31, 15 and 20, let me just read a couple of those verses so that people can understand what I'm saying here. So Genesis 37:30, and he returned, this is Reuben, returned to his brethren and said, "The lad is not, and I, where am I going?" And then in verse 35, when Jacob learns that, as far as he knows, Joseph's been killed by an animal, and all his sons and all his daughters rose to comfort him, and he refused to be comforted, saying, "For I go down into mourning unto my son in Sheol," and his father wept for him. So this is what it says in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. And this is, well, it says what it is. So thus says Jehovah, "A voice in Ramah is heard, wailing and weeping most bitter. Rachel is weeping for her sons. She hath refused to be comforted for her sons because they are not."
Yeah.
And verse 20, "The precious son is Ephraim to me, a child of delights. For since my speaking against him, I do thoroughly remember him still. Therefore, have my bowels been moved for him. I do greatly love him." An affirmation of Jehovah. The interesting thing about this is similarity in I guess, the phraseology here. And but another thing to be noticed here is that Rachel is weeping for her sons, and the only one that she mentions by name is not Joseph. It's not even Benjamin. It's Ephraim, which is interesting. Kind of goes in favor of the Moses scroll, because the Moses scroll seems to recognize Manasseh, Ephraim, Benjamin as belonging to the fourth wife, which would be Rachel. But the phraseology, Ross, what do you make of it?
Well, I've pointed that out for quite a few years when I teach through the Torah cycles, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it's actually the only place in the Tanakh, those two occurrences where that refusing to be comforted, that precise form is used in those two passages. So it really is supposed to connect.
Oh, it's verbatim, is it? Those ones are precise.
It's not verbatim. It's not verbatim, but it's the same verb and so forth. So it's a different, slightly different, but the same wording basically. So, but refuse to be comforted in both cases. So, I think it's clearly doing just what you did and saying, "Come see me here." So neither of them can be comforted. Good stuff.
Yeah, excellent.
One more thing on the sources.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, one more thing on the sources. So when we look at the story, and I want to make sure, we already talked about Reuben saved Joseph in E, Judah saves Joseph in J, the Midianites take Joseph in E. In fact, if we really trace this back, all the way back to chapter 25, verses 2 and 4, in Genesis, the birth of Midian and Medan, the Midianites, that's part of E as well. So Midianites, E. And so it's consistent. Yeah, and
it's consistent.
J, it is consistent. In J, the Ishmaelites take Joseph. And by the way, if we're reading J, and then we go into 38, which is something which we'll do in a moment, as soon as we come out and we pick back up with the Joseph side of the story in 39, There we have the Ishmaelites again. When you read it together, it's very confusing. Who's got Joseph? It's like a shell game. Is it the Midianites, the Midianites, the Ishmaelites? Now, just to be fair, there is one verse that tries to tie all this together. Do you know where it is? In Judges. Judges chapter.
That's right.
Judges chapter 8 and verse 24.
It conflates Ishmaelites and Midianites as well. Is that right?
That's pretty much what it does. And Gideon, by the way, this is talking about the salvation from the hand of Midian in context, verse 24. Gideon said unto them, I would make a request of you that ye would give me every man the earrings of his spoil. For they had golden earrings, Jono, because they were Ishmaelites. So this is sort of, like you said, it's conflating. It wants you to say, well, if you say Ishmaelites, you're talking about the Midianites. One thing about the Midianites that I want to get in, I know that if you look at a lot of Bible maps, you'll see they place Midian on the east side of the rift, on the east side of the Jordan Rift, and then south of the Dead Sea, and usually in the area of what is now modern-day Saudi Arabia. So, and they put like a star, like this is Midian. And, a lot of people think that Horeb is in that region and so forth. And there's a lot in the Bible about Midian and the Midianites. But what I've come to, at least as a working hypothesis, is to see that the Midianites aren't to be found in a single place. We see them all over. And it makes me think that rather than thinking of Midian as a single geographical place on the map, that they're more like Bedouin, that Midianites and Bedouin are similar in that they move about. In fact, in the Joseph saga, we see an example where the Midianites, and part of that story says Ishmaelites, but they're coming from Dothan and they're on a trade route to bring spice and so forth down into Egypt. So, I think that they're more like Bedouin. That's just my thought, and it still stands to be proven, but that's where I'm at right now. So I wanted to bring that in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know that the Moses Scroll mentions Midianites and seems to conflate them with Moabite women, but I think differently about that now. I think what's actually happening in the Moses Scroll is that Moabite women are the wives of the Midianites, therefore they're Midianites. So that's interesting. All right, so chapters 34 and 38, we jumped over 34, and that was the rape of Dinah. I know you've got some things to highlight in 38. I'm going to let you do that. Otherwise, I would jump over that again because both of them are entirely J. Some scholars propose that they are interjected into the text to cover for another math problem that appears in 46 verse 27. Now, we're not going to get there yet. And when we do get there, and by the way, that verse there is attributed to the P source. But that verse is actually derived. The P source is deriving that from the Moses Scroll, and it has to do with the 70 that go down into Egypt. And what P is trying to do is make the math work. But it seems like the interesting thing about this is that it seems like the narratives of chapter 34 and chapter 38 are cover chapters or interjected narratives to make this math work, which suggests that either the J source had its own explanation as to how, who were the 70 that went down into Egypt, or, Ross, J, this section of J was written after P, which got me thinking. I thought, and it's trying to just, work it in with P. So, and I thought, but I understand that P is very late, and I had to look this up. And actually, the wiki has a very interesting little take on this, and it says Julius Wellhausen, okay, so the 19th century German scholar who formulated the documentary hypothesis, fixed the chronological order of its sources as the Yahwist and Elohist, Yahwist being J, followed by the Deuteronomist, and lastly, Priestley. So Priestley was much later, and this is Wellhausen's take. At the end of the 20th century, a growing number of scholars placed both the Yahwist, the narrative strand, and the priestly material, a mix of narrative and legal material in late Neo-Babylonian or Persian periods. And it goes on, but basically schools out on this as to whether, who was the last to write. Do you have anything to add there?
Not really. It is a debate. I mean, in other words, first of all, the entire documentary hypothesis is debated, but there is debate over the dating of the different sources. But I was going to take something else you brought up and run with it for just a minute. And I know we don't want to dig too deep into chapter 46 and verse 26 yet, or 25 and 26, because that's coming later. But I did want to, I also had in my notes, the Pentateuch as we have it clearly has Joseph going into Egypt and making a way for the family and so forth. And, you meant it for bad and God meant it for good. And that's the story. The Moses scroll, as you alluded to, just simply says in GC 2, I think in the second verse of fragment G, it says this. It says basically that they went into Egypt 70 souls. Now, the interesting thing about that, and we will get into it more in detail when we get to that Torah portion, but that number is not the same in all our ancient sources, is it?
Right. No, that's true. So, what else you got? Oh, there's one in the New Testament, isn't there?
Well, not only the New Testament, but other sources. But again, I don't want to get too much into that yet because we're going to get into it later. Yeah, I mean, we're still in I just wanted to touch that because it's simply the Joseph saga gives us a lot of information as to why those however many souls went into Egypt. The Moses scroll just simply says this number of people went into Egypt. That's all it says.
Yeah, that's all it says, and it doesn't have to tell you who they are. But what happens is that P attempts to tell us who they all are, and it gets difficult because, as we've already mentioned, there are at least two sources that are stitched together, and you have to try and make the math work with the already established narrative, or so it would seem. And in order to make it work, you need to play with it a little bit, and you have to explain that with some story, and therefore you end up with chapters 34 and chapter 38. We'll get into that in some detail when we get to chapter 46. But while we're in chapter 38, or I'm about to jump over it, what do you want to pull out of it?
No, you can't jump over it, man. This is some great
something
stuff.
There. Go ahead.
No, that's right. Not only is there used to, I thought, wow, it just feels like it's totally interrupting, and it is, Jono. If you read 37 and you leave 38 out, and then you read 39, it flows perfectly. But this is a piece of brilliant redacting, editing, whatever. But the story of Judah inserted here really gives us what I would call sort of two theaters playing at once. You have the Joseph saga playing in theater 1, and in theater 2 you have the Judah saga. And so it's interesting because if you read 38, you'll see that that's not a quick story either. It deals with Judah, and he's got a Canaanite wife by the name of Shua. He has 3 boys. 3 boys are born, Onan, and Shelah, right? Now, I'll quickly run through. We know that there is he doesn't want to give the third because the first 2 have died. And, I've got notes.
And that's
we won't
important.
Get in. It is
We're going to get to that later, but that's important. Yeah, go ahead.
And I don't want to get into it too much, and I don't want to get into the rule in Deuteronomy about the levirate marriage and so forth. However, there are connections that I wanted to make. Number one, when his daughter-in-law, Tamar, says, hey, do you recognize these? And she holds up the garment. Remember, we're supposed to look for these garment changes. She uses a phrase that is hakerna, and it really means recognize these. And I think that this is interesting because we see it in one other place and one other place only. So I'm just going to give the people the two episodes where one is in Genesis 37, 32, and it says, let's see, Let me look for it.
Well, from 31 it
Yeah.
says, and they took Joseph's coat and slaughtered a he-goat and dipped the coat in the blood, and they went, they sent the coat of many colors and brought it to their father, and they said, we found this. Recognize it? Is it your son's coat or not? Cruel.
That's right.
Very cruel.
That is cruel. And then you see basically the same language in verse 25 of chapter 38. When she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law saying, by the man whose these are, am I with child? And she said, discern, I pray thee, whose are these? The signet, the cords, and the staff. But in the Hebrew, it's that exact phrase. Only used twice, 37:32 and 38:25, twice in the Tanakh. Now,
and they're both attributed to the same source.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
again,
Makes sense.
you see these connections, and it follows the sources, and it's really, really convincing when you really put it together. One other question that I have, and I want to ask Ezra, and then we'll see how well Ezra does on this question. But did Judah give Shelah to Tamar?
No, Judah did not give Shelah to Tamar as her husband, even though it was expected according to the practice of levirate marriage at the time. In Genesis 38, after Tamar's first husband, Judah's eldest son, died, Judah instructed his second son, Onan, to fulfill the duty of raising offspring for his brother. When Onan also died due to his disobedience, Judah promised Tamar that she could marry his youngest son Shelah once he was old enough. However, Judah did not follow through with this promise. He feared that Shelah might die as well, like his brothers, and so he withheld Shelah from Tamar. Tamar, recognizing that Judah had not kept his word, eventually took matters into her own hands. She disguised herself and tricked Judah into fathering her children, Perez and Zerah. This act secured her place in the family line and upheld the continuation of Judah's lineage. Judah later acknowledged Tamar's righteousness in this situation, admitting that she is more righteous than I, for as much as I gave her not to Shelah my son. Genesis 38:26.
All right. Now that's what most people say. Now let me just throw something out, Jono, and now I'm going to ask you, because what we see from Ezra is the typical answer is that no. And if you just read the Pentateuch, that's the way you come away with the solution, is that he just didn't. But in 1 Chronicles chapter 4 and verse 21, it says, the sons of Shelah, the son of Judah. Now notice the name, the father of Lekah, and Laadah, the father of Marashah, and the families of the house of them. Yeah, so
That's cool.
It makes me wonder, at least the chronicler is trying to say that Judah finally did the right thing. So Tamar takes things into her own hands. Yes, we know that. That's the way that the most people understand it. But I think from this text, it does suggest that Judah ultimately did give Shelah to Tamar.
No, that's really cool. So let me ask you a question about that. Does the chronicler acknowledge the death of the two boys? Does it mention that at all?
Not that I recall. Not that I recall.
So I expect that would be the case. That is very, very curious. And once again, that plays into what will be our discussion when we get to chapter 46. Wow. Wow. That is really interesting, Ross.
Cool stuff.
That is really cool. Is there anything else in chapter 38 that you want to highlight? I haven't seen that. That's really cool.
I think the only thing that we just touch as we move into 39 and 40 is that, you have another story of twins, these born by Judah and Tamar. And just as in Genesis 25, 21 through 26, we had a hand on a hill. Here you've got another handsy set of twins. You remember one hand comes out first, Pretz, and there's a red ribbon tied. So in 38, 27 through 30, what is it with the twins and the hands at the birth? I've got 6 kids. I don't have any twins, but these are interesting stories to say the least.
Yep.
That's it
absolutely.
on 38. I mean, it's a beautiful story because it gives us one other final point on 38. Because Judah has this tragedy where he loses 2 sons, The writer of Genesis is going to show us that that is going to play in later in the story, and we'll come back and revisit that. But I think it's significant that he is able to convince his father of something later in the narrative.
Chapter 39 is entirely J. Chapter 40 is entirely E. That's interesting. It says that Joseph had an attractive figure and was handsome, just like me, Ross.
Yeah, I was going to say, just
pull out
like
of 39.
Yeah.
No, you were. What do you want to pull out of 39?
Well, I think, again, we have follow the garments. Potiphar's woman, she sees Joseph, this good-looking guy, probably the perfect size human. I can imagine. He's 5'8". He weighs about 189, 190, and he's wearing this whatever kind of jacket he's got on, and she snatches it from him. Again, Jono, it's the garment. You have to follow the garment. He ends up getting thrown in jail. But think about this. The garments and deceiving. Jacob deceives his father by dressing in a hairy garment like Esau. The boys fool daddy with the bloody garment, acting like Jacob is dead. Tamar, she's got this whole garment thing. Now we've got this thing about Potiphar's woman. It reminds me of a passage in Zechariah 13, verse 4. Does that ring a bell?
Go ahead.
Let me just, let me see if I'm right on the verse. And it shall come to pass, and this is totally out of context, by the way, Jono. It just reminds me of it. It shall come to pass in that day that the prophets shall be ashamed every one of his vision when he prophesieth, neither shall they wear a hairy mantle to deceive. But he shall say, I'm no prophet. I'm a tiller of the ground, for I've been made a bondman from my youth. It just, there's something about these garments and the deceptive mode. And it really does remind me of actors. They're just, it's the curtains closed, they open. The writers, the editors, the redactors are giving us another cool story to read.
So I have a question for you, and this only just popped into my head. I'm just trying to find it. I know that Abraham is referred to as a Hebrew, and it's curious because I don't think this word is used a lot in Genesis. And we have here in verse 17 that Joseph is referred to as a Hebrew slave, and I'm curious if it is the same source. But I can't remember. Go ahead.
All right. So let's look. Let's just see in Genesis 14. Is it verse 13? Let's see. It's verse 13. Yeah, the Hebrew. Okay. I just opened up the wrong window here. Let me go back. Verse
Genesis
13.
chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14 is, according to Richard Elliott Freeman, attributed to what he calls other. This is something. This is the whole
that's right.
Melchizedek.
That's right. Okay. So let's look at this passage. Where is it in 40 that he's
you're right. It's verse
referred
13.
to?
Yeah, 14:13. And an escapee came and told Abram the Hebrew, and then and he's attributed that to other. But here we're in J and refers to Joseph as the Hebrew slave.
Yeah. What verse? That's what I'm asking. In chapter 40,
I'm sorry.
what verse?
Chapter 40 is verse 17.
15. Yeah, I see it in 15 too. The land of the Hebrews.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's E. You're right. One thing
that's
that
J. You got J or E? Hang on, let me just clarify. What do you got there?
No, chapter 40 is, I think it's E.
See, I'm looking at 39. I'm looking at 39, and he's referred to, you brought us a Hebrew man, that's in verse 14, and then in verse 17, the Hebrew slave whom you brought to us. Now, you're in 40, which is E, and you're saying that E uses the term Hebrew as well.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Three different sources using the term. Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting is, and we're going to see this as we go through, one thing that you'll find if our viewers look up and do a study on the word Hebrew, the title Hebrew, it is almost exclusively used to refer to these people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, whoever, descendants of Abraham, but it's by a foreigner. So now you get in the book of Jonah, Jonah refers to himself as a Hebrew, but almost without exception in these earlier books, or those that are presented to be earlier, it's used by the Egyptian rulers and so forth. So, but it would be interesting to do just to tabulate, just to go through them. Jono, now that you mentioned, you've got an other. We just looked at it. Other, a J, an E. And I haven't done that. I'm curious now.
Oh, well. All right, we'll get back to that. If anyone has anything to add to that, put it in the comments. We'd love to read them. Mm-hmm. What else, Russ? What else have we got?
More dreams, Jono. We don't have to dig into them yet because we're going to get more dreams. But in chapter 40, we have the second of 3 sets of dreams that carry along the Joseph saga. This one is about a cupbearer and a baker. And we see that Joseph in the story begins to see, hey, God knows what these dreams mean. And they play significant part in the life of Joseph from the beginning in chapter 37 all the way through his time in the slammer and prison, as we say.
It's almost as if these vivid dreams are planted into the heads of these characters so that Joseph, through God's giving him the ability to divine these dreams, may supply the interpretation. It makes one wonder why not just give a clear dream, baker and what is the baker and the candlestick maker? You guys are going to die. Or one of you you're going to die. The other one's going to be we have to give you some obscure dream so that Joseph over here can tell you what it means, and then it comes true, and then Joseph becomes revered. So it's interesting, isn't it? So a vivid dream as a premonition for the purpose of raising Joseph to power.
Yeah, and one thing maybe we can get into a little bit in the next time we encounter these dreams, I think we've even mentioned it in a previous Torah Pearls episode, is that we get another account in the book of Daniel where a foreign ruler has a dream and one of these Hebrew boys cracks this mysterious dream. So maybe that. Now, do you do that? Can you interpret dreams, Jono?
You know what? We had this discussion before, didn't we? So some people really are quite convinced that vivid dreams are sort of a heads up of something coming their way, and when something similar that they can kind of weave into, it's a little bit like that. Therefore, that's what the dream was about. I know people like that. You know people like that. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced.
Well,
but the thing, what? Just speaking of Daniel, really, it's always bothered me that even Daniel was given a dream, and then he's chatting with the angel, going, "I don't know what this. Can you tell me what this means? I don't even know what it means. What?"
Yeah.
So then, things like that really bother me. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I've made it very clear. I've said this to you and even online that I don't remember the dreams that I have, and but again, I know people that have a lot of insight that they have received through dreams, and they would certainly say yes.
Yeah, and let me clarify what I just said, because what I just said is not to rule out that God might give you a private revelation through a vivid dream.
Right.
I'm not ruling that out, but I don't think that every dream is. Even in I think the Book of Job says dreams come from the busyness of the day, or something to that effect. And of course they do, and we know that. But I tell you, if I wake up with a vivid dream, Ross, or if you wake up with a vivid dream, you and I are going to tell each other about it, and we'll go, what does it mean?
That's right.
So I can't blame someone for that, but if something is really very specific and you feel like you've been spoken to, and I have had a couple of dreams like that, I will admit, I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't rule out a private revelation from God to you. But generally speaking, it's not my rule of thumb.
That's right. Hey, look. Well, I was just going to say that our next Torah portion is going to be Miketz. That's right, Genesis 41:1 through 44:17. So our listeners and our viewers, you can look ahead and jot down some questions now and put them in the comments. Put them on Truth to You. Put them on the YouTube video
Under this
here.
video, yep.
That's right. And maybe that way we can have more questions. Thanks to Clody and thanks to Mama MacGyver.
Yeah.
And what was the other? Edenic?
I think Edenic Christian 335. If they're controversial enough, we're going to read them out.
That's right.
And we're going to have fun with that. That concludes our Torah Pearls, I do believe. So we will be back this time next week with Nick Hitz. And until then, Ezra, take us on out.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for today's journey through the twists and turns of Genesis. From blessings and birthrights to broken promises and bold moves. The stories of our ancestors never fail to challenge, inspire, and remind us of the human struggle intertwined with divine purpose. So whether you're wrestling like Jacob, waiting like Tamar, or learning like Judah, remember, there's always more to uncover in the text. Thanks for joining us here on Torah Pearls. Until next time, keep digging deep, keep asking questions, and may your studies be as rich as the stories themselves. See you soon.